They took everything from him in the space of a single afternoon, and by sunset, the town had already forgotten his name. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your town or your state. And if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a gun, stay with me, because what happened next didn't make a sound, but it changed everything. The sun hung low over Dry Creek, stretching long shadows across the dirt road as Elias Crow stood in the middle of what used to be his life, boots planted in powdery dust, eyes steady, not on the men riding away from his land, but on the ground at his feet, where a dinted silver canteen lay half-buried in ash and sand. The wind moved slow, carrying the dry smell of cedar and heat, whispering through broken fence posts and warped boards that used to be his porch, and around him, people watched. Men leaning against hitching rails, women standing in doorways, hats low, eyes careful, like they were witnessing something they didn't want to remember later. No one spoke to him. No one stepped forward, not even old Mr. Halvorsen who'd shared coffee with him every Sunday for the past 3 years. And that silence, it said more than words ever could. Sheriff Dalton Briggs adjusted his gloves near the edge of the road, posture relaxed, like a man who believed everything had already been decided, and beside him, a folded paper caught the light, crisp, official-looking, the kind of paper that erased a man without leaving a mark. You heard the ruling. One of the men muttered, not quite looking at Elias. Nothing left here belongs to you. And the words landed flat, like they'd been said too many times before. Elias didn't answer, didn't argue, didn't reach for anything that wasn't already gone. He just bent slowly, knees creaking with the weight of long seasons, and picked up the canteen, brushing sand from its surface with the back of his hand, his fingers tracing the faint engraving near the rim, worn smooth by time. Someone laughed, low and uncertain, but it died quick when Elias straightened, because there was something in the way he moved. Not anger, not defeat, something quieter, something harder to name. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in dull gold, and the heat began to break, replaced by that creeping desert chill that settled into bone and breath. And still he stood there, alone in the middle of what used to be his, holding the only thing no one had thought to take. Then, without a word, Elias turned toward the open desert beyond the last fence line, where the land stretched flat and endless for miles, where no road marked the way and no promise waited at the end. And he started walking, one step, then another, boots pressing into dry earth that hadn't seen rain in months, his shadow long behind him, stretching back toward a town that had already decided he didn't exist. No horse, no water, but what little might still be left in that old canteen. No reason anyone could understand. And as he crossed past the final post, the wind picked up just enough to carry dust across his path, blurring the line between where he had been and where he was going. Behind him, someone said, "He won't make 10 miles. Another voice answered, "He won't make 5. But Elias never looked back, not once, because out there, past the reach of law, past the reach of men like Briggs, there were older things than paper and fences, older than towns that forgot. And as the last light slipped beneath the horizon, swallowing him into the vast silence of the desert, the only sound left was the soft metal knock of that silver canteen against his leg, steady, patient, like it knew something the rest of them didn't. The desert did not welcome him. It simply allowed him to exist within it. And that was the first lesson Elias Crow learned before the stars even finished rising. The heat bled out of the ground as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold that slipped through his coat and settled into his bones, each breath turning sharper, thinner, as if the air itself was testing whether he deserved another one. He walked until the town behind him became nothing more than a memory swallowed by distance, until even the faint glow of lanterns disappeared, and there was only open land stretching mile after mile in every direction, flat and endless like a quiet promise that did not care if he lived or disappeared. The silver canteen tapped softly against his thigh with every step, a small, steady rhythm that felt louder out here than it ever had back in town. And once, just once, he lifted it to his lips, tilting it carefully, letting a single swallow pass. Not enough to satisfy, only enough to remind himself it was still there. The wind shifted sometime past midnight, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and something older, something that did not belong to fences or deeds or the kind of paper men like Briggs believed in, and Elias slowed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the ground ahead, because the desert spoke in marks and silence. And if you listened long enough, it told you who had passed through and who had never made it back. Faint impressions in the sand, half erased by wind, not one set, not two, but several, moving in a pattern that did not follow any road, and Elias did not change direction immediately. He only adjusted his pace, subtle, deliberate, the way a man does when he knows he is not alone but does not intend to announce it. Hours passed like that, measured not by clocks but by the slow drift of stars overhead, and when the horizon finally began to pale, just a thin line of gray breaking the darkness, Elias stopped near a stretch of low rock, the kind that held on to the last of the night's cold, and he crouched, setting the canteen down beside him, his hand resting on it for a moment longer than necessary, as if grounding himself to something real. That was when he heard it, not loud, not sudden, just a shift in the air behind him, the faint crunch of sand that did not belong to wind or drifting dust, and he did not turn right away, because out here, sudden movements were mistakes men did not get to correct. Instead, he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying just far enough. "If you have been following me, you are closer than you think." And the silence that answered him stretched thin, tight like a drawn wire, before it broke with the sound of a single step. When he finally turned, slowly, rising to his feet, he saw her standing a few yards back, framed by the first light of dawn, still as the desert itself, her dark hair pulled back, her posture balanced in a way that spoke of control rather than threat, and her eyes were fixed not on him, but on the canteen at his side. She did not reach for anything, did not raise her voice. She simply said, in careful English that carried the weight of distance and patience, "That does not belong to you." And Elias studied her for a long moment, the wind brushing between them, carrying dust and something else, something familiar that he could not quite place. And when he answered, his voice did not rise, did not challenge. It settled into the space between them like something already decided. "It was given to me." And that was when her gaze finally lifted to meet his, sharp, searching, as if measuring not the words, but the man who carried them. And in that quiet stretch of desert, with the sun just beginning to climb and the world holding its breath, something shifted, not in the land, but in the balance between what had been taken and what had not yet been returned. She did not step closer, and that was the second thing Elias noticed. Not fear, not hesitation, but distance chosen on purpose, the kind that meant she understood exactly where she stood and what it cost to move any nearer. The morning light spread slowly across the desert, turning the sand pale gold, revealing more than the night had allowed, and with it came detail, the faint line of tracks behind her, not hidden, not careless, simply there, as if being seen was part of the message. Elias kept his hand resting near the canteen, not gripping it, not guarding it, just acknowledging its weight, because whatever this was, it was not about water anymore. The woman tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing as she studied him the way one studies a story that does not quite fit the ending they were told. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty. "Who gave it to you?" Not a question, not exactly. More like a door left open to see if he would step through. Elias let the silence stretch a moment, the wind brushing between them, lifting the edge of his coat, carrying the faint metallic scent of the canteen into the air, and then he answered, "A man who said I would need it when the time came." And even as he said it, the memory settled deeper, not sharp, not loud, just steady, like something that had been waiting its turn. Her gaze flickered, just once, to the horizon behind him, then back, measuring distance, direction, something beyond what he could see. And she took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, the sand shifting softly under her boot. "That canteen does not carry water," she said. "It carries a promise." And the words did not sound like explanation. They sounded like recognition. Elias exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool morning air. And for the first time since leaving the town, something inside him shifted, not doubt, not fear, something closer to understanding, and he lifted the canteen slightly, turning it so the light caught the worn engraving along its side, a mark he had never fully read, only felt. Then it is not mine to keep, he said, voice low, even. But it was given to me for a reason. And that was when she finally closed the distance between them. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the space felt shared, and she nodded once, as if confirming something unseen. You were not chosen by accident, she said, and behind her, far out across the open desert, movement began to take shape, not clear, not loud, just a shifting line against the horizon, like heat bending the air, like the land itself deciding to rise. Elias did not turn to look, not yet, because he could feel it, the same way you feel a storm long before it reaches you. The pressure, the weight, the sense that something larger than any one man was beginning to move, and the woman followed his stillness with her own, her voice quieter now, almost lost to the wind. They took from you what they could see, she said, but they did not know what you carried away. And the words settled between them like a truth that did not need repeating. Elias tightened his grip on the canteen just enough to feel its edges press into his palm, grounding, real. And for the first time since he stepped into the desert, he allowed himself to ask, not with urgency, not with demand, but with the quiet weight of a man who had already crossed the line behind him. What happens now? And she looked past him again, toward that distant movement growing clearer with every heartbeat, her expression unchanged, calm. As the land itself. Now, she said, the desert remembers. And as the sun climbed higher, the shadows behind Elias began to take form, not one, not a handful, but many, rising out of the horizon like something that had been there all along, waiting for the right man to walk far enough to be found. The line on the horizon did not rush. It did not charge. It simply grew, slow and certain, like something that had never needed to hurry for anyone. And Elias stood where he was, boots planted in cooling sand, the silver canteen steady in his hand, while the morning light stretched farther across the desert and revealed what the night had hidden. Shapes became riders, riders became figures, and figures became presence, not loud, not threatening, just there, moving in quiet formation that spoke of discipline older than any town Elias had ever known. And beside him, the woman remained still, her eyes forward, her breathing even, as if this moment had already happened somewhere long before this morning. Do not move, she said, not as a warning, but as a truth, and Elias did not, because something in him understood that movement now would not change what was coming, only how it would be received. The wind shifted again, carrying the soft rhythm of hooves across the open land, not fast, not slow, just steady, and with each passing second, the number became clearer, not a handful, not a dozen, more, far more, enough that the horizon itself seemed to bend under their presence. And still, there was no sound of threat, no raised voices, no sign of urgency, only a quiet arrival that felt heavier than any storm. Elias lowered the canteen slightly, his fingers tightening just enough to feel its edges, grounding himself in something small, while something vast unfolded before him. And he glanced once at the woman. You knew they would come, he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what had become obvious. And she nodded once, her gaze never leaving the line ahead. They were always coming, she replied. You only had to walk far enough to meet them. And that answer settled into him in a way that made the past few days feel less like loss and more like direction. The riders slowed as they drew closer, spreading slightly, not surrounding, not closing in, just forming a presence that filled the space without claiming it. And at their front, one figure moved a step ahead of the others, older, his posture straight, his eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his hat. And when he stopped, the others stopped with him, not a command spoken, not a gesture made. Only understanding passed between them. Silence followed, deep and complete, the kind that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel larger. The wind, the shifting sand, the faint metallic knock of the canteen as Elias adjusted his grip, and then the older man spoke, his voice low but carrying easily across the open distance. You walked with what was given. And Elias felt the weight of those words before he fully understood them, felt them settle into the same place the desert had been speaking to all night. Elias took a step forward, just one, careful, measured, not crossing into anything that had not been offered. And he held up the canteen slightly, not as a shield, not as proof, simply as truth. I was told I would need it, he said, his voice steady despite the quiet weight of the moment. And the older man's gaze dropped briefly to the silver, to the worn engraving that caught the morning light. And something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not doubt, recognition. Behind Elias, the woman moved for the first time since the riders appeared, stepping forward to stand just at his side. Not behind him, not ahead, beside, and her presence there changed the balance of the moment in a way Elias could feel without fully naming. And she spoke in her own language, soft, measured, the words flowing like something practiced and precise. And when she finished, the older man inclined his head slightly, a gesture small enough to miss if you were not looking for it. Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, because whatever this was, it was not judgment, not the kind he had left behind in town. This was something else, something that did not rush to decide. And the older man stepped forward one pace, just enough to close part of the distance. You carry a debt that is not yours, he said, and Elias felt that land harder than anything spoken before, because it was true in a way he had not yet admitted. And he looked down briefly at the canteen, then back up. Then I will return it, he answered, simple, direct, and for a moment, nothing moved, the desert holding its breath around them, until the older man nodded once, slow, deliberate, and the riders behind him shifted, not forward, not back, just enough to change from presence into something else, something that felt like alignment. And the woman beside Elias spoke again. Quieter now. Now you understand, she said, and Elias looked out. Across the gathered figures, across the land that had felt empty only hours before, and realized the desert had never been empty at all. It had only been waiting for him to see who truly stood with him when everything else was gone. The wind settled as if the land itself had come to a decision, and in that quiet, Elias felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not yet, but a steadiness he had not carried since the day the town turned its back on him. The older man's words lingered in the air, a debt that is not yours, and Elias turned them over in his mind the same way he had turned that canteen in his hands, searching for where they began and where they would end. He took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows there is no going back, and stepped forward another pace, closing the distance just enough to be seen clearly, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as a man who had chosen to stand. Tell me whose debt it is, Elias said, his voice even, carrying across the stillness without force. And the older man studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp, not judging, but measuring. The way the desert measures a man by how long he lasts when there is nothing left to take. Behind them, the riders remained silent, their presence no longer distant, but not pressing, like a wall that did not trap, only defined the space of what was happening. The woman beside Elias shifted her weight slightly, her gaze moving between the two men, and when the older man finally spoke again, his voice carried something deeper now, not just authority, but memory. It belongs to a man who chose mercy when he had reason not to, he said. And the words settled heavier than anything before, because Elias knew, without needing to ask, that this was not a story about someone else. It was about a moment he had buried and left behind. The older man lifted his hand slowly, not pointing, not accusing, simply indicating the canteen in Elias's grasp. Years ago, in a place not far from here, a man was given water when he had none, and in return, he gave his word, not to repay, but to remember. And as he spoke, the desert around them seemed to pull tighter, the space filled not with sound, but with something like recognition, like the land itself had heard this story before. Elias lowered his eyes briefly to the canteen, his thumb brushing the worn engraving again, and this time, the shape of it felt different, less like a mark, more like a name he had forgotten to read, and the memory came not as a flash, but as a slow unfolding, a figure in the heat, a man on the edge of collapse. The choice to stop when it would have been easier to keep writing, and the simple act of handing over water without asking who or why. He exhaled quietly, the realization settling into him with a weight that was not regret, but understanding, and when he looked back up, his voice had changed, just enough to carry what he now knew. I remember, he said, and the words did not sound like a defense, They sounded like acceptance. The woman beside him nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if something long set in motion had finally reached its point, and the older man's expression eased, not softened, but aligned, as if Elias had stepped into a place already prepared for him. "Then you understand why they are here," the older man said, and he gestured slightly, not grand, not commanding, just enough to acknowledge the riders behind him, and Elias turned his head, just enough to see them fully now, not as distant figures, but as men who had come not for conflict, not for conquest, but for something far more exact. The number was clear now, far beyond what the eye could count in a single glance, spreading across the horizon in a line that did not end where the land met the sky. And yet, there was no chaos in it, no noise, only order, only purpose. Elias faced forward again, the canteen steady in his hand, and for the first time since he had been left with nothing, he felt the shape of something returning, not his land, not his home, something else, something that could not be taken by paper or silence. "They took everything they could see," he said slowly, the words forming with quiet certainty, and the woman beside him finished the thought, her voice calm, unwavering. "But they could not take what was given in truth," and the older man nodded. Once more, a single motion that carried more weight than any command. "Then it is time," he said, and the riders behind him shifted, not forward, not back, but together, like a single breath drawn across the desert, and Elias felt it. That moment where choice becomes action, where walking away is no longer the path, and standing is the only thing left. He tightened his grip on the canteen, feeling the cool metal press into his palm, and without looking back at the place that had cast him out, he took one step forward, into the line of riders, into the quiet that now stood with him. And as the sun rose higher, casting light across the gathered figures, the desert no longer felt empty. It felt like it had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal what had been there all along. They did not move like an army, and that was the first thing Elias understood as he stepped into their line. They moved like men who did not need to prove anything, each rider holding his place without crowding the next, each horse calm beneath the rising sun. And as Elias walked forward, the space opened for him without a word, without a signal, as if the path had already been decided long before he took his first step. The woman remained at his side, her presence steady, neither leading nor following, and the older man turned slightly, enough to guide without commanding, and together they began to move, not toward the town, not yet, but deeper along the edge of the desert where the land rose in low ridges and shallow stone, places that held shade even when the sun climbed high. Elias kept his eyes forward, but he felt it, the quiet alignment behind him, the way the riders matched his pace without pressing him, without surrounding him. And it was not control, it was choice, their choice to walk with him, not for him. And that difference settled into his chest heavier than anything he had carried before. The silver canteen rested against his palm, its surface warm now from the sun, and he turned it once more, studying the engraving, tracing the faint lines until the shape became clearer, not letters in the way he knew them, but symbols that spoke of something older, something that did not belong to paper or quartz or the kind of ownership he had lost. "What does it say?" Elias asked quietly, not looking away from it, and the woman glanced down, her expression unchanged. "It does not say anything," she replied. "It remembers," and that answer lingered, because it felt true in a way that did not need explaining. They walked for what felt like miles, though time in the desert did not measure itself in minutes or hours. It stretched, folded, and settled into something slower, something that made a man aware of every step, every breath, every choice to keep moving. And as the sun rose higher, the land shifted around them, the open sand giving way to scattered rock, the wind breaking into softer currents that carried less dust and more silence. Finally, the older man slowed, and with him, the others came to a halt, not abrupt, not forced, just a natural end to movement, and Elias stopped as well, his boots settling into the packed earth of a narrow ridge that overlooked a shallow valley below. The view opened wide, revealing a path that cut through the land like a quiet line, the same path that led back toward the town, though from here it looked smaller, less certain, as if distance had taken something from it. Elias followed that line with his eyes, his jaw tightening slightly, not in anger, not in regret, but in recognition, because that path had once been his, every mile of it familiar, every turn known, and now it felt like something he was seeing for the first time. The older man stepped beside him, his gaze resting on the same distant line. "You can return alone," he said, his voice calm, without pressure, "and nothing will change." And Elias felt the weight of that truth immediately, not as a threat, but as a simple fact, the kind that did not bend to hope or anger. The woman spoke next, her voice just as steady. "Or you can return with what was always yours." And Elias turned slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to meet her eyes. And there was no challenge there, no demand, only clarity, the kind that leaves no room for confusion. He looked back down at the valley, at the path that led to the place where he had been erased, and then at the canteen in his hand, the one thing he had carried out, the one thing that had brought him here, and slowly, deliberately, he lifted it, holding it at chest level, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. "I did not come out here to take anything back," he said, his voice low, even, carrying the truth he had only just understood. "I came because I had nothing left." And the older man nodded once, as if that was the answer he had been waiting for. "That is why you were able to receive," he replied, and the riders behind them shifted slightly, not forward, not back, but into readiness, not for conflict, but for movement, for direction. Elias lowered the canteen, his grip steady, his shoulders easing into something new, something that felt less like loss and more like purpose. And when he took his next breath, it did not feel thin or uncertain. It felt full, grounded, as if the desert itself had decided he was no longer just passing through. He looked once more at the path below, at the place that had taken everything it could see, and then he stepped forward again, this time not alone, this time with the quiet weight of something behind him that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as the first rider began to follow, then another, and another, the line formed not as a show of force, but as a reflection of something far older, something that did not belong to men like Briggs, something that could not be written or erased, only remembered. And as Elias walked, the desert moved with him, not around him, not behind him, but with him, like a promise finally being kept. They did not raise dust as they moved, and that was what made it unsettling in a way Elias could not name, because a line that long, that wide, should have shaken the ground, should have filled the air with noise, but instead it flowed behind him like a quiet current, steady and controlled, as if each rider understood that what they carried was not force, but presence. The path down the ridge narrowed as it dipped toward the valley, and Elias stepped carefully, boots finding familiar ground that no longer felt like it belonged to the man he had been, and with every step, the town ahead grew clearer, the roofs, the water tower, the thin line of the main road cutting through it like a scar that had never healed. He could already see movement there, small at first, then sharper, figures gathering, watching, because news traveled faster than any rider when it was carried by fear and uncertainty. Beside him, the woman remained silent, her gaze fixed ahead, and after a while, Elias spoke, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond her. "When we reach them, there will be no understanding at first." And she nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of something already known. "Understanding is not the first thing people choose," she said. "They choose what they have always chosen." And Elias let that settle, because he had seen it himself, had lived inside it, the way a town could decide what was true before hearing a single word. The older man rode a few paces behind now, not leading, not pushing, simply present, and the riders stretched back farther than Elias could see. Without turning, a line that did not break, did not falter, and as they reached the base of the ridge, the ground flattened into that long approach toward Dry Creek. The same stretch Elias had walked so many times before, only now it felt different, not because the land had changed, but because he had. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of wood and dust from the town, and with it came memory, not sharp, not painful, just there, reminding him of what had been taken and what had been left behind. He adjusted his grip on the canteen, the metal warm now, steady against his palm, and he lifted it slightly, not as a signal, not yet, just feeling its weight, its purpose. The first figures at the edge of town stopped moving as they saw him, their posture shifting, uncertain, and then their eyes moved past him, beyond him, to the line that followed. And that was when everything changed, not in sound, but in stillness, the kind that falls when a man realizes what he is looking at cannot be explained away. Elias did not slow, did not stop. He kept his pace even, measured, each step deliberate, and the riders behind him matched it without instruction. Without hesitation, a quiet agreement carried through movement alone. The woman finally spoke again, her voice calm, almost soft. "Do not speak first," she said, and Elias glanced at her briefly. Then forward again. "I will not," he replied, because he understood now that words were not what this moment required. As they crossed the invisible line where the desert ended and the town began, the air felt different, heavier, filled with the weight of expectation and the remnants of choices made too quickly, and the people of Dry Creek stood where they were, not approaching, not retreating, caught between what they thought they knew and what stood before them now. Sheriff Dalton Briggs appeared near the center of the road, his posture still confident, but his eyes sharper now, searching, calculating, and for the first time, Elias saw something there that had not been present before, not fear exactly, but the absence of certainty. Elias came to a stop a few yards from him, the space between them clear, open, and behind Elias, the line of riders settled into stillness, not closing in, not spreading out, simply there, filling the space with a presence that could not be ignored. No one spoke, not at first. The wind moving softly through the street, brushing against hats and coats, carrying the faint sound of leather and quiet breath, and Elias stood with the canteen in his hand, not raising it, not hiding it, just holding it where it could be seen, and in that silence, something began to shift, not in the land, not in the people, but in the understanding of what could no longer be denied. Because this was not a man returning alone, and whatever had been taken from him no longer felt like the whole of the story. No one reached for anything, and that was the strangest part, because in Dry Creek, silence usually broke the wrong way, into shouting, into quick decisions, into men trying to prove something before they understood it. But now the silence held, stretched tight between Elias Crow and Sheriff Dalton Briggs, between what had been taken and what had returned without asking permission. Briggs shifted his stance slightly, boots grinding against the dirt road, his eyes moving past Elias again and again, counting, measuring, trying to turn what he saw into something smaller, something he could still control, but the line behind Elias did not shrink, it did not bend, it simply remained, quiet and certain. "You brought a lot of company," Briggs said at last, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the street, but it lacked the ease it once had, and Elias did not answer right away. He let the words settle, let the town hear them, feel them. Before he spoke, his voice calm, steady. "I did not bring them," he said, and that was all, nothing more. And somehow it weighed heavier than any argument. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uncertain. People shifting where they stood, glancing at one another as if hoping someone else would explain what they were seeing, but no one did, because there was no simple explanation left. The woman beside Elias stepped forward half a pace, not enough to take the lead, just enough to be seen clearly, and her presence drew the eye in a way that did not demand attention. It earned it, and she looked directly at Briggs, her expression unchanged. "You took what was not yours," she said, her voice even, not raised, not sharpened, just placed into the space between them like a fact that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Briggs gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had found any support. "I followed the law," he replied, and that word, law, hung in the air, thinner now than it had ever sounded before, and Elias shifted his weight slightly, the canteen still in his hand, catching the light as he lifted it just enough for everyone to see. "Then show it," Elias said, not loud, not forceful, just clear, and Briggs hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough for the people watching to notice, enough for the certainty he had worn to slip. The older man stepped forward from the line behind Elias, his presence quiet but undeniable, and when he spoke, he did not raise his voice, yet it carried across the entire street. "Paper does not make truth," he said, and the words landed in a way that no one could ignore, not because they were louder, but because they felt older, deeper, like something that had existed long before this town was ever built. Briggs straightened slightly, trying to reclaim ground that was no longer steady beneath him. "This is not your concern," he said. But even as he spoke, his eyes moved again to the riders, to the number, to the stillness, and Elias saw it clearly now. Not fear, but the realization that control had shifted without a single shot, without a single threat. Elias took one step forward, closing the space just enough to stand where his land once began, and he lowered the canteen slowly, deliberately, placing it on the ground between them, the metal touching dirt with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than anything else. "That morning, this was given," Elias said, his voice steady. "Not for me to keep, but for me to remember." And he looked at Briggs, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far heavier, something that did not need to be proven. "You took what you could see," he continued. "But you did not see everything." And the silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, as if the truth had already been decided and was simply being recognized. The woman glanced down at the canteen, then back up, her voice quiet, almost soft. "Now it is returned," she said, and behind Elias, the riders did not move, did not step forward, did not need to, because what stood in that moment was not force, it was something else, something the town could feel but not push against. And Briggs looked at the canteen on the ground, then at Elias, then beyond him, and for the first time since Elias had known him, he had no immediate answer, no quick word to close the gap. And in that small, quiet hesitation, everything began to change. Briggs looked down at the canteen as if it might speak for him, as if that small piece of silver could somehow explain what the town could no longer ignore, and for a long moment, no one moved, not the men on the street, not the riders behind Elias, not even the wind, which seemed to pause at the edge of the buildings like it too was waiting to see what would be chosen next. Elias did not step closer, did not press forward. He simply stood where he was, hands at his sides now, empty, because the only thing he had carried into this moment no longer belonged to him, and somehow that made him steadier than before. Briggs lifted his eyes again, scanning the faces around him, searching for the certainty he once held in them. But it was not there, not in the way it had been, because something had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and the people who had watched Elias lose everything were now watching something else entirely, something they did not yet have words for. "This does not change anything," Briggs said finally, but the sentence fell flat, thinner than before, and even he seemed to hear it, because he did not repeat it, did not push it further. He only stood there, caught between what he had claimed and what stood before him. The older man stepped forward one last time, not to confront, not to accuse, but simply to stand beside the truth that had already been placed on the ground. And he looked not at Briggs, but at the town itself, his voice calm, steady. "What is taken without honor cannot be kept," he said, and the words moved through the street like a slow wind, settling into places people had not expected to feel anything. A woman near the general store lowered her gaze. A man by the hitching post shifted his weight, and somewhere in the quiet, someone removed their hat, not as a gesture toward Elias, but toward something larger, something that had just been made visible. Elias watched it all without expression, not because he felt nothing, but because he understood now that this moment was not about him alone. It was about what the town would choose to see when there was nothing left to hide behind. The woman beside him glanced once at the canteen, then at the people, and her voice came soft, almost like a reminder rather than a statement. "You saw him lose everything," she said. "Now see what remains," and that was when it happened. Not loud, not sudden, just a single step, then another, as old Mr. Halvorson moved forward from the edge of the crowd, his hat in his hand, his posture slower than it used to be, but steady, and he stopped a few feet from the canteen, looking down at it, then up at Elias, his eyes carrying something like regret, but also something like resolve. He did not speak, not yet. He only reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, worn at the edges, and held it out toward Briggs, not with anger, not with defiance, but with quiet certainty. And Briggs looked at it, then at him, then back at Elias, And for the first time, he did not reach for control, he reached for understanding, even if he did not fully grasp it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with choices being made one by one, not forced, not demanded, and Elias felt it, not as victory, but as balance returning to something that had been tilted for too long. Behind him, the riders remained as they were. Still, present, not advancing, not retreating, because their purpose had never been to take, only to stand. Elias took a slow breath, the desert air still lingering in his chest, and he looked once more at the town, at the people who had turned away, and now turned back, not because they were told to, but because they could no longer pretend not to see. He did not smile, did not nod, he simply turned slightly, stepping back from the canteen, leaving it where it rested in the dirt between what had been and what would be, and as he did, the older man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and the riders began to shift, not as a retreat, not as an ending, but as a quiet closing of something that had been opened. The woman stepped back as well, her place beside Elias no longer needed in the same way, and as the line behind them began to turn with the same calm certainty it had arrived with, the town remained still, watching, understanding settling in like dust after a long wind. Elias stood there a moment longer, then looked down at the canteen one last time, not reaching for it, not claiming it, and in that simple choice, everything that had been taken lost its weight, because what remained could not be taken again. And as the desert slowly reclaimed the horizon behind him, the town of Dry Creek was left with something it had not expected, not fear, not defeat, but the quiet knowledge that justice had come without a single raised voice, and that it would not be forgotten.